Yes, the Georgia Baptist Mission Board discipleship team, led by Scott Sullivan, exists to help churches take the next step toward becoming a healthy, disciple-making church. We've developed tools to help you, like the WATERSHED principle, which identifies 6 main ministries needed to be a healthy church. The Spark Conference, a total church strengthening event that allows you to access keynotes and breakouts all year long for ongoing training in your ministry area. This year's conference features keynote speakers Fred Luter, Michael Catt, Todd Bolsinger, and Robbie Gallaty, as well as online and in-person regional events. Learn more at www.thesparkconference.com. We also have learning communities across Georgia to sharpen, encourage, and resource leaders personally and professionally. Find a community near you at gabaptist.org/discipleship. Don't forget you can find our previous episodes on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and your favorite podcast platform. Now let's join today's broadcast or podcast.
Hey friends, we're glad you are with us today. I'm Ray Sullivan, discipleship consultant down in the South regions of Georgia with the Georgia Baptist Mission Board, and just super excited to be with you today. The topic that we're going to talk about today, you want to be a part of. I'm just going to tell you this. This is a conversation for you. A lot of times we're talking about things that you can do to help your people. And of course, that's in play here. But what we're going to talk about today is something I think is so beneficial to you and to your ministry as a disciple and as a disciple maker. So thank you so much for joining us. As we go through this conversation today, just want to remind you, you can get in the chat there if you're on Facebook Live. Let us know where you're watching from, and any questions you may have. We'll be glad to interact with you. If you're watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast or anything like that, hit that like and subscribe button, and let us know that you're with us today, and keep up with all the different broadcasts that we have coming each and every week for you. But I'm excited today. I've got a good friend of mine, a new friend of mine, Drew Hyun, with me today. And Drew is I think, Drew, you are the lead pastor at Hope Church in New York City, and also the church planner, and you've started a network of churches there in New York. And unfortunately, a lot of our guys may not be familiar with you. So as we jump in today, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so honored to be here. Thanks so much, Ray, and so grateful for the work that you're doing, and really grateful that I can also call you a new friend. And so I'm a pastor here in New York City, and I've actually moved out here in 2001, right before 9/11, to intern at a church called New Life Fellowship in Elmhurst, Queens. And I served as an intern and then kind of rose in the ranks at that church until I left in 2011. And then in 2012, my wife and I, we felt called to plant a church here in New York called Hope Church NYC that would eventually become a family of churches here in the city. And out of that, we would also start a network called the New City Network that's co-founded with a buddy of mine named Edwin Colon. And the New City Network is really a network of urban churches that value urban, multi-ethnic, spirit, emotional health, and mission. So currently, I'm actually the lead pastor of Hope Midtown, which is part of the Hope family of churches. And Hope Midtown is right here in Midtown Manhattan. And so that's where we live, my wife, as well as our 2 kids, 10 and 6, David and Avery, and my wife's name is Tina. So that's a little bit of my background and where we are now and where we're situated.
Well, that is so cool, man. I tell you, I got to know you about you before we met. You were speaking at the Discipleship Forum in Nashville back in November. And that's where I got to hear you speak. And you were talking about the emotional health of the disciple maker. And I tell you, man, that just triggered something with me. I remember sitting there, I was up in the balcony there at Brentwood Church in Nashville, and I was listening to your talk, and it just struck so many chords in me. This is my 31st year in ministry, and most of that spent as a senior pastor. And Drew, I'll tell you, man, in 2016, I hit a wall. I had been at the church I pastored for about 13 years, and God had done some incredible things, and he was teaching me a lot. But, I had just hit one of those walls, and I remember coming to a place and saying, Lord, I'll do anything
Mm.
You want me to do? I'll go sell cars. I'll work in an auto parts store. I'll be a layman. But this pastor thing, this church leader thing, I just don't think I could do this anymore.
Mm.
And in that wall, man, something happened to me has never happened before. I had an anxiety attack.
Wow.
Um, I had heard about those. I had never experienced one of those, but man, I just basically, being honest, I came undone. I remember I called my dad. My dad called one of my deacons, a good friend of mine who was a doctor. He came to my house to help me. I mean, I just could not control my emotions. I was just done. And so I was thinking, when you were talking there in Nashville and you were talking about emotional health and some of the things that we're dealing with as pastors and staff, a lot of times we talk about in our broadcast, we're talking about what we're doing in the church and different programs and different methods, but man, it's the stuff we're dealing with inside that really nobody's talking about. And so in your background, you talked about being there at that church when you kind of started as an intern. And I know you were there with Pete Scazzero and part of that when Pete was writing Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, which is an incredible book that spoke to me on so many different levels. But let me ask you this question as we kind of dive in here. From your study and your experience, man, what does it mean to follow Jesus well? When we talk about emotionally healthy discipleship, we're talking about the heart of the pastor or the heart of the leader. What does it mean to follow Jesus well?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And to give you some background on how emotionally healthy discipleship has influenced my life and how it relates to that question that you're asking, is I was part of like an immigrant church growing up. The church had massive amounts of conflict internally within that church. And so there was this disconnect between like, how does one live out faith? And yet people who are talking about following Jesus, and yet there's all this strident conflict that's happening within the church. Moreover, my dad, he himself was a minister, and he was a minister who would go on to write books, and his books would end up being bestsellers for Korean Christians. And in many ways, he became a Korean Christian celebrity. So he was this extremely well-known Christian figure within Korean circles. And the only thing is, like, when it came to his relationship with us, I have 3 brothers, so 4 of us boys, and my mom, he had very strident, acrimonious relationships with all of us. It was very violent at home. And so his relationship with his boys then, like all of us, had a very hard time with Christian faith, because here he was, this very public figure. And we just could not match like who he was on stage. He was this incredibly charismatic person who preached up a storm and was this also well-read author. And yet at home, we experienced him as a very unloving, harsh man who we often felt unloved by. Now, what's interesting is my dad, the topic that he would write about of the books that he had written was about how to raise a family. So you can imagine that disconnect then between his public life, someone's public life, and one's private life. And so I think when we talk about emotionally healthy discipleship, and so it's kind of in God's providence that I ended up, having that experience, going through my own crisis of faith that really came out of like, it doesn't make sense for followers of Jesus who claim to follow his teachings, have such a disconnect between how they are in their private worlds, in their lives. And finally, but came to faith nonetheless, because I just believed in this Jesus fellow and who he was. And so I end up graduating from university, end up going off to become an intern at this church, which is in New York City, New Life Fellowship, which you mentioned, Pete Scazzero. And he was in the middle of writing this book called Emotionally Healthy Church, which later became Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, and then later Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And Pete himself had gone through his own journey. Pete was someone who had gone through a journey of really getting the best of evangelical training. Gone to a very strong Orthodox teaching seminary up in Massachusetts called Gordon Conwell, been trained at InterVarsity as an InterVarsity staff worker. And so like so much of his training and formation had come through evangelical discipleship. And what he noticed, but then he goes on to plant a church. The church does incredibly well. It's building and growing, but internally his marriage is really suffering. And internally, the church is full of strife and conflict. And everyone sees the gleaming picture of like how great this church is. But internally, he's a mess. And he goes on to share his own story about what led him to emotionally healthy spirituality. And so when we talk about emotionally healthy discipleship, the main thesis is basically that it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. In other words, emotional health and spiritual maturity are inseparable. Because if the great commandment is about loving God and loving others well, oftentimes what happens is we miss the great commandment, and somehow there's this American type of Christianity. I say American, but it's probably very Western, that tends to be very surface level. And we often use the image of an iceberg to kind of describe this. An iceberg, of course, 10% of an iceberg is seen above the surface, and one would see it and be like, wow, that's a big iceberg. But little do people know that 90% of an iceberg is actually below the surface. Yeah. And I think in a lot of, again, Western contexts, the way that we relate, and especially in today's social media saturated world, like so much of life, and even especially the temptation for a lot of pastors like myself, is to present an image, that 10% that looks a certain way. But little do people know the 90%, and really what it means to follow Jesus. And when Jesus says, follow me, leave everything and follow me, what he's basically saying is, I want all of you. Discipleship is not a halfway kind of thing. It's everything. And if it's everything, that it includes that 90%. Not just the 10% kind of behavior modification, or practice this, start using this kind of language, and maybe have these exterior practices. And this is nothing against some of the spiritual disciplines that we've been taught growing up or anything like that. This is simply to say, will we allow God and Jesus to transform the 90%? The parts of us, perhaps, that we aren't used to allowing people to see. When it comes to some of the issues of our family of origin, some of the ways that we've been formed by our own woundedness and our own kind of inability to handle difficult emotions that lead us into bad habits, destructive habits that only we know personally, or only the people close to us know personally. Yeah. And so really what we're looking for when it comes to emotionally healthy discipleship is this integration of allowing Jesus and the truth of the gospel to really be invited into every part of who we are, the public parts and the private parts, and that we would start to live lives of integrity. Integrity being like, the word integer, a whole number, comes from that's the same root for integrity, having a certain kind of wholeness where, I'm not faking it. I don't have just this public persona that mismatches against who I am in private or who my family experienced me as. But instead, there's this real wholeness, and kind of out of that, then my leadership, my life with Jesus, my life with God, my life as a pastor, it flows out of an authentic place instead of out of this bifurcated, dual lives kind of place, but instead it's one whole kind of life. So I think that's what we mean. Sorry, that was a long-winded kind of answer to the question, man. But yeah,
that's exactly, and I'm sitting here and I wish I could scribble, I want to scribble, but I know if our viewers, they're going to see me looking down and all that, but I want to be scribbling notes. But man, you said something. You said it's impossible to become spiritually mature and remain emotionally immature. And I'm telling you that when we talk about discipleship, and so much of what I've learned over the last several years is discipleship is relational. Jesus did discipleship relationships. He spent time with his disciples, and so many pastors, so many leaders, I would say, so many, preachers and pastors don't have these relationships. And so everything's on the surface. Yep. And people don't know, and they don't know I didn't know how to express that. I didn't know how to deal with that. I didn't know how to deal what was below the surface, because nobody ever told me that, and that was the stuff that was buried, and so, man, it's just, I guess maybe that's why it resonated so much when I was reading that book, that we just don't have good discipleship. Has become so much about knowledge and information about the Bible, and that's Christian maturity. So we measure maturity based upon how much we know about the Bible, not about what we know about ourselves and what the Bible's doing inside. And so, man, that is just so rich. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was thinking about this interview and I heard you talk about is you talked about, that a lot of us are struggling with a definition of success.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big part of most of us leaders, we're leaders because we have vision, and we want to see things happen, and we want to be a part of that. But at the same time, we put a lot of burden on ourselves,
Yes.
to produce. And man, COVID has certainly wreaked havoc on our churches, and probably even more on our leaders. One of the things that I've noticed that our pastors are struggling with is smaller numbers. I mean,
Yeah.
so many of our ministries were based upon Sunday morning attendance and how much money was given and how many people were saved. And, it's all numbers based. And so COVID has, just threw that in a loop. And so what I've seen is, pastors don't have the programs they used to have. They don't have the attendance they used to have. And a lot of guys, quite honestly, Drew, they just feel like they're failing right now.
Yeah, sure.
So what do you see as probably the core problem of that? And what would you say to those guys that are struggling right now with just feeling like they're a failure?
And I've obviously lived through that season. I mean, our church, when COVID hit and New York City was the epicenter, our church lost 50% of our people in terms of they moved away. And our giving was down 30 to 40%. We had a violent break into this building that we had just, invested in. So there were so many painful moments. And what was interesting, and I think this actually describes probably what, again, Western spirituality can often look like. I remember when COVID hit, of course, everyone was bewildered as to what was happening. And one of the frequent mantras that I heard was, this is our moment as the church to be the church like in early Christianity that went into the towns during the plagues and served the people and things like that. And I got real fired up. And the reason why I was fired up by it is because, again, my heart is mission and growth and numbers and seeing something as an opportunity. And Pete Scazzero, he was one of the few mentors that I talked to. And so part of me was like, yes, we can do this. Let's do it. And one friend calls it, there was the rally and then there was the valley, And it was interesting because Pete was one of the few voices that instead he was telling me, Drew, now's the time for you to really double down on investigating what's happening in your own soul and learning to grieve and to suffer with people. And to, instead of coming with a triumphant word of like whatever the triumph might look like, to instead come with just grief and sadness and lamentation over this global wall, this pandemic that we're facing. And then I was on a call with some pastors later on, and Tim Keller was actually sharing about his memory of 9/11 was that when 9/11 happened, he remembers someone spoke to him and said, just be careful of what happens 3 to 5 years from now. Because when a crisis happens, all hands are on deck and then people end up getting worn out. And I remember Tim was just saying so even during this crisis, the real test of how we've been spiritually and emotionally mature or resilient will actually not show up in the first 1 or 2 years. It'll show up in years 3 to 5.
Wow. Yeah.
And he was saying that because I think the evangelical world, we are so good at being active and missional. And so much of it is on outward behavior and outside metrics. And we have learned that success is basically up and to the right. And I think because that measurement is there, I'm constantly measuring myself up against that standard, the standard of we need to be growing. And we need to be, the budget needs to be booming and everything needs to be going well. And then my own soul gets predicated and my identity formation gets kind of tied into that. And so much of American Christianity is about up and to the right. It's about being success in many ways, metrics that follow the ways of the world. Now, this is not to say that every growing church is doing poorly. In fact, I want every church to do well. This is simply to say, if you were to look even at scriptural examples, John the Baptist would have failed miserably, right? He drove away crowds. Abraham was just tasked with not building a great church, but just investing in the next generation, And so I think there's all sorts of evidences, and even Jesus, right? He shoos away crowds, and crowds start to scatter after he does this great miracle. He gives this hard teaching about his flesh and his blood and suffering, and everyone's leaving. And he says to Peter, do you want to go too? And Peter says, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. And I just think that success needs to be redefined in, because now the measurement of success wasn't like how many people are showing up. It's how many people are like logging into your stream and liking your, your post or whatever. And I think that cycle just ended up or ends up. And I know it did for me. I often joke that like the reason why people's statistics, the pastors' stream statistics were up so high is because I was watching all of those other churches and comparing myself,
Me too.
Yeah, I know. And I think, Pete has this definition, which I love, about success in God's eyes. Success is doing God's will in his way and in his timing. And what that means then is God is the definer of what is successful. I am not, nor is whatever publication or evangelical hierarchy or my denominational hierarchy. It's doing God's will, God's way, and in his timing. Yeah. And if I can just release the outcomes to him, if I can do in his revealed will, right? Just being faithful to him, spending copious amounts of time in prayer and allowing God into that part of my iceberg, right? And doing everything I can, and yet at the same time resting in the promise of his goodness and his grace and his sovereignty. Like, even though we've lost 50% of our congregation, even though our budget is down 30%, like, is there a rootedness that I have of God? I know that my performance is not my worth is not predicated on my performance. And I know that these anxieties, the messages that have come to me is I'm a loser, the same way that my father told me I'd be a loser, and all these things, all these voices again that would haunt me. And even during this pandemic, I need to get to a place before God where all the outside noise, right? And this is where, for Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, we talk about the contemplative tradition, one's prayer life, how one's prayer life is so important, because I need to be able to kind of tune out the voices of American Christianity, American Western Christianity, that keeps giving these markers of what success looks like, and being able to say, God, success is doing your will in your timing and
in your
doing
way.
And in your way. And if I can do that, which I know, what is his revealed will? To love my family, to sacrifice for them, and to care for them, and to make sure that they are flourishing as best as I can, to love the people in front of me, whoever might be there, right? To love God.
I love that, Drew. I mean, I want to interrupt you here, but to love the people in front of me, whoever they may be, at that moment. I think that's what I'm seeing so much. I was on the phone most of the morning calling pastors because we're trying to, just connect with some guys, and especially ones that we haven't heard from a while. And I talked to several pastors this morning. One of the questions I was asking them, and it was kind of interesting because I knew when I asked this question what I was going to get. And we're kind of updating our records, and I'm like, during 2020 or 2021, what was your average worship attendance? And I would always predicate that. I said, well, I know COVID, and man, and you can just hear the depression kind of come into the conversation. Like, man, it's been tough. It's just been so hard. And I just hear this defeat, but it's like, man, I love that the people that are in front of you, and a lot of that is your family and those close relationships and your friend. And I heard you say one time, discipleship, it's a long play game. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's long play, but it's an investing in those people that are right there. You said something earlier I love, and I want our guys to go back and think through this again in their life. We've experienced this. You had the rally, and now a lot of guys are in the valley. The charge was there. We were going to go. The COVID was going to give us the opportunities. Everything was going to change. We were going to come out. I remember we were having conversations about post-COVID, what are the opportunities this is going to bring for the church post-COVID? Man, those conversations are not existing, right now. So good. So let me ask you this. We're talking about these pastors, and I want to kind of get into this a little bit because I've heard you say something. And I wrote it down when I was there in Nashville, and I wrote it down the other day when I was talking with you. And that is that, as Christians, Jesus may be in our heart, but grandpa's in our bones. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about that whole success idea and where the emotional health of where our leaders are right now, break that down for us. What do you mean by that? That Jesus may be in our heart, but grandpa's in our bones. And how does that play out in the life of a disciple each and every day?
Yeah, I think it plays out in this belief, because when we become Christians, there's this belief: behold, you're a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. And when we talk about spiritual formation, we think of ourselves as being like this clean lump of clay who now God is going to mold and shape into whoever he wants it to be. But the reality is we've all been deeply formed, as my buddy Rich Velotis often says. We've been deeply formed already when we come to faith. And the things that have formed us, oftentimes it might be Fox News, CNN, our trauma, our woundedness, our friendships. And one of the things that we talk about in Emotionally Healthy Discipleship is you've been formed a certain way, and it's now about being reformed into the image of Jesus. And one of the ways that we've been most significantly formed is our family of origin. Yeah. And of course, in the scriptures and even in the Old Testament scriptures, it talks about this when it talks about, the consequences of sins that are passed on from generation to generation. And you see these patterns exist. And those patterns are basically, each one of us, we've all inherited good stuff from our families of origin, but we've also inherited things that don't look like the kingdom of God and Jesus. And we can just go down the list of the ways in which, like when it comes to how I handle money and my anxiety towards money, does it look more like someone who's part of the new family of Jesus, or does it look more like the Hyun family, the immigrant family that was so worried about money and that would be tight-fisted about it because we were so worried, right? Like now, when we say Jesus may be in your heart, but grandpa's in your bones, what we're saying is when it comes to the ways that we've been formed by the world, oh man, grandpa's in your bones. It's in my bones. And so the way that I go about resolving conflict, the way that I go about dealing with my anger looks more like what I experienced in the Hyun family than it does like James chapter 1 and 2, about being slow to speak, quick to listen, slow to anger. And, the way that I handle my anxiety looks more like the Hyun family in blaming other people and in running to addictive behaviors. It looks more like that than it does like Ephesians chapter 4, speaking the truth in love, and grieving not the Holy Spirit. So in all those ways, now we don't often think that, we need to talk about those issues because the new has come, but it's like, no, don't you understand? We've all been shaped and formed. And the reality is I'm often blind to it. I'm often blind to kind of like when I got married to my wife, right? And I was like, why are you washing the dishes that way? Right? And for me, it's because I've been formed by one way of washing the dishes. She's been formed by the other way. And now it's just a matter of like, when we come into any kind of relationship with God, what we're basically saying is, God, help me to reform all of my patterns. Now, again, this is not to say that, every family is bad, because all the good patterns, all the stuff that I got from my parents that are great, and that from my family of origin that are great, that are God honoring, I want to keep doing. But there are certainly habits, like when it comes to my attitudes towards different cultures. I mean, just think about that. I came from a Korean American background. My parents' generation, war-torn, their parents were occupied by the Japanese. Yeah. And so you could imagine so much pain and anguish towards and animosity towards the Japanese as a result of that. Now, if like I can go into my life and I can talk as much as I want about Galatians and Ephesians chapter 2 and, having a love and kindness towards one's enemies like Jesus does. But I'll tell you what, like, the lessons that I learned about how I should really be wary of Japanese people, and it's embarrassing to share this, but it's at the same time, it goes at the root of like, wow, there's some deeply entrenched sinful patterns and beliefs in my background that would shape how I would treat an entire group of people that comes from my family of origin. Now, that does not look like the way of Jesus. Now, again, we can go down the list of the different areas, when it comes to money, when it comes to success, which we talked about, when it comes to how we resolve conflict, when it comes to attitudes towards different cultures, and so many of these different ways. And so I'm constantly, even now, having to go back in order to go forward. I'm constantly having to go and investigate, like, I was joking the other day, like my daughter, she's 6 years old. She wanted me to read this fairy story with her, and she runs up to me, says, Daddy, help read this story for me. And like, my initial impulse was like, go ask your mom. Like, don't talk to me about this. And in that moment, she comes up to me and I'm like, Hyun men do not do this stuff. Like, we are emotionally unavailable, distant workaholics. I didn't say that to myself, but in my mind, like, there was everything in me had to stop and take a deep breath and be like, yeah, let's read this fairy story together, and to be present with my daughter. Now, someone might look at that and be like, that's not disciple. Well, of course that's discipleship.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And where do the tentacles of everything in me that did not want to do that? It was, it was the way of the Hyun family, not the way of Jesus. And so I think all of that is what we talk about when we say, Jesus may live in your heart, but grandpa lives in your bones. Like, we're deeply formed by our families of origin, and we need to go back to investigate some of those things in order to find a path forward in being part of the new family of Jesus and living a new way.
That is so good. And that's kind of what I was thinking, because you use that. We think all that time, I'm a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come. But yeah, that's true. I'm a new creation. I'm an heir to Christ, of Christ. I'm adopted as a son of God. Yes, that is true. But that doesn't erase everything that I've brought into who I am. And I think a lot of us, I know the older I get, the more I recognize these things in me. Of why I do what I do. And I'm still dealing with that with my wife. We've been married 30 years. And I'm still having to come to grips with that, And I guess when we talk about the public side and the personal side, maybe that's where we struggle. We're like, why am I doing this when I'm a Christian? Why am I doing this when I know the Bible says I need to do this? And it's not taking inventory. It's not recognizing where this is coming from and then beginning to work through that and deal with that. We just think, well, I became a Christian, that's gone. This is my new life, I'm moving on. And man, it just doesn't quite seem to work that way.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. One thing I wanted to kind of circle back, you had mentioned earlier, and I wanted to ask you this because we talk a lot. I mean, I'm Baptist, Southern Baptist, and we talk a lot about the Great Commission. And when we talk about discipleship, we talk about healthy disciples. I know there's the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. And when we talk about success, and that's where a lot of our guys are struggling right now because we're not seeing the numbers. You talk about spiritual maturity in regards to both the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. Why is that important, and what's the difference there?
Yeah, I think that our tradition is really great at the Great Commission, missions organizations, expansion, and, frontier kind of work. I think that's embedded in our own family DNA as a movement, as Christians, evangelical Christians in the West. And I think a lot of that stems from the Great Commission, Matthew 28. But we often can be pursuing the Great Commission without the Great Commandment. And it's possible. I mean, it's possible to actually do ministry for God without God at times. I mean, we've we've been trained in practices. And I mean, that's where this disconnect exists, right? Is, and there's these examples even through scripture. Jesus would actually predict it. He'd say, like, people will say, like, did I not prophesy in your name? Did I not cast out demons in your name? Did I not do miracles? And he says, depart from me, I never knew you. Jesus actually predicts that somehow we can actually do ministry for God without God. And that's why the Great Commandment is so important. And the Great Commandment, when it comes to the Great Commission, which is to go and make disciples, the Great Commandment is basically at the heart of that. It means the Great Commandment is what it means to be a disciple.
To be a disciple, yeah.
And so oftentimes, and that's why when it comes to the metrics of success for, again, in the Western American Christian world, it's so much of it is predicated on baptisms. And I mean, I know that the things that people often measure are baptisms and how many people attended, and then how much money is coming in. But you and I know that, like, that's not all there is to shaping a disciple.
Yeah. Now,
again, I'm not trying to discount the measuring of any of those things. I'm simply saying, like, even if those are the only things that we're measuring, then that's such a shallow way of looking at it. And I think, again, our tradition is really great at the Great Commission. It's the Great Commandment that we often lose. And sometimes it's because we've fallen so deeply in love with the Great Commission that we've actually forgotten the Great Commandment, to love God and to love others well. And so that's
the be before the do.
Yes, to actually, yep, that's a great way of putting it, to be before we do.
And I think, I guess I come back to that because in this time of COVID, when so much of our success is built on numbers and people are struggling, we forgot about the opportunity really here to invest in people and go back to what you said, the people right in front of you, starting with your family, those people in your close circle. Jesus, we talk about it all the time. Jesus ministered to the crowds. Yes, he did. But Jesus really poured into those 12 and specifically into those 3. And, we ask guys all the time, who are your 12? Who are your 3? Who are the people that are right there in front of you that are still there?
Yes.
That you have an opportunity to love and to love well. That's success.
Yes.
And not saying that we're scrapping the Great Commission. We are doing that, but discipleship begins in those intimate relationships. And that's what I just want to encourage our guys. I think about that all the time, is we're just thinking so much about the big picture right now that we're missing the forest for the trees.
Yes.
Missing the trees with the forest. It's right there in front of us. Opportunities, love our wives, love our children, disciple them, pour into those people that are still there, and love them. Love God and love those people. So let me ask you this. I know we got to wrap up here. So getting practical. So we've talked about a few different things. We've talked about the emotional health, really, of the disciple maker. And we know we have issues that we need to deal with. And some of those have been brought out through COVID and some of the things that we're dealing with in our culture. So let me ask you this, from your experience and what you've been seeing. So what are some practical steps for guys that are watching today to do to help us begin to focus? Because I know we have, me included, we have a tendency to neglect our own emotional health. Okay.
Yes.
So what are some practical steps to help us begin to focus on our emotional health so we can finish well? We say all of the time, and our team, we want to help our leaders finish well, but we know, and I've been reminded through you, this emotional side is very important. So practical steps, give us some things that guys can begin to look at and think about.
Yeah. And first, just to comment further on what you just said, like, I mean, as a pastor, because the outer life is just such a natural, like, tendency, like, at the neglect of my own soul. I mean, I'm the type of person who will run to help someone else while I'm hurting myself. And, it's kind of like, that statement when you're on a plane, like, make sure you put your own mask on before you put on someone else's.
Wow. Yeah.
And otherwise I'm no good. And one of the things that we say in Emotionally Healthy Discipleship is, as goes the leader, so goes the church. And so your health and my health is paramount to the future of our church and churches. And so making sure that we're in that space. And so I would, in terms of practical, like, application, I would recommend.
Help us put the mask on. So what are some things we can do to put the mask on?
Yeah. I think one easy tool that is available is at emotionallyhealthy.org. There's actually an inventory that you can take related to your own emotional health and spiritual maturity that you can do. And you can get a sense of where you are right now. And you can take it just for your own well-being and inventory. It's kind of like doing a Psalm 139 check-in, right? Mm-hmm. Search me and know me, God, to really get to the heart of like, how am I really doing? Again, because so much of what we do is focus on the outer, we really do need to take inventory. And I think number two is to slow down enough to be with God before doing anything, Wow. And so
hey, let me ask you this, Drew. Hey, hate to interrupt you, but so emotionallyhealthy.org, we'll put a link to that in the interview here on the chat. But I heard you talk about this the other day, and one of the things you said is, yes, I think it's something that we ought to take, but it may be something you may ought to give to your wife or give to somebody close to you, maybe an accountability partner, and say, hey, will you take this for me?
Yeah.
What are some things? Because I know me, man, and I can sit there and I can say, well, I know this is what I'm supposed to say or what I think, but maybe there's some other people that may be able to help us to see things in ourselves. I heard Jim Putman talk the other day. I've been reading Revolutionary Disciple. And one of the things that he said in there that just really lit me up, and I mean, I just recognized how much I've missed this over the years, is that in John 15, we are called to abide in Christ, but we don't abide in Christ in isolation. And I think, man, we have taken our spirit. We think the spiritual life is just between me and Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters. But God has put other people in my life to help me abide in Christ. And we do that through, again, I go back to relationships, but maybe this is an opportunity to say, hey, are there 2 or 3 guys in my life that I'm meeting with that are in a D group with me or disciple group, or maybe even my wife or, somebody else close that I would say, hey, will you take this? Will you look at this? What are you seeing right now in me? Are you serious enough to put it out there for somebody else? I mean, is that something you think would be helpful? Or
I think it is, as long as the relationship is in a lot of goodwill.
Yeah, that's why I was asking the question.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the things. Like actually, Pete and Jerry Scazzero, Jerry's his wife. They often like say, we won't meet with a pastor alone. We want the spouse to be there because then we'll get the truth.
Yeah,
and so so that's where it is really helpful to have someone else, just kind of fill out that inventory as well.
Talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, and you talked about slowing down.
Yeah, slow it down. And I think, one practice that's been really formational for me is Sabbath keeping, taking a 24-hour Sabbath to stop, rest, delight, and contemplate. And that's part of that inventory taking process. And that's why we say that, the contemplative life and emotional health go together, because I need to slow down my life to be able to, I realized in my staff meeting this morning, I kind of reacted pretty strongly when someone made a statement about changing the time for our staff meetings. I just, and I need to take the time to reflect on that. Why did I react that way? And was it something that I need to make amends for? I don't think I need to make amends because I don't know if the person even experienced it. I just know what happened in my soul.
Yeah.
And was it because what that person said made me feel disrespected? And why did I feel that way? All the person suggested was moving the times to Monday, And I need to do that soul work now. I need to journal. I need to reflect. I need to just slow down enough to have the time to be like, what was happening? And then of course I submit that to the Lord. And after I've submitted that to the Lord, is it something where now I have to check in with that person and just say hey, I'm curious, when you said this, what did you mean? And now I have to bring it up in a kind way if it reaches that point, but all of that internal work takes time.
Yeah.
But again, instead of taking intentional time to be with God, I think we take a lot of time instead to be active. And Eugene Peterson, he once said, "You're busy because you're lazy," in his book, The Contemplative Pastor. And I always wondered, what do you mean? Why would he say that? You're busy because you're lazy. And he said, you're busy because you're lazy in that you're not taking the time to prioritize what's really important.
I just hated that, Drew.
Yeah.
I hated to hear that. That is so true. You're busy because you're lazy, and it's work. to sit there and deal with those things and let God really begin to chisel away.
Yeah.
Teach us.
Yeah.
One other thing you mentioned, you've talked about the practice of the daily office.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of part of Sabbath a little bit, but it's not just the one time of. So what is the practice of the daily office, and how could that help us emotionally?
Yeah. So the daily office, these were basically practices that actually come from Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
Like you see Daniel, for instance, pausing throughout the day. And the psalmist writes about, 5 times a day, I pray to you. And then you see these different early Christian traditions where people would actually, their office or their work, their main work was to pray. And so a daily office is this practice where one pauses throughout the day in prayer and in scripture, to take that inventory before God, as well as use that time for intercession. And so I grew up in the tradition of quiet times, and it was basically like, you do your quiet times, you get filled up in the morning for 30 minutes. And if you're really good, maybe an hour, and you're like superstar if you're above that.
You're good to go all day.
Exactly. But then by 9 o'clock, I'm on the subway here in New York, and I'm kind of agitated that's so crowded. Then I get into work and someone else is late for a meeting, and then I'm even more mad. And then, I haven't even, by that time, I've already forgotten anything I prayed and anything I worked for, and then by 12 o'clock noon, I'm so frustrated. I'm not even a Christian anymore, that's
you're striking a chord, Drew. I mean, you're striking a chord with us.
Yeah. And so the daily office is basically this discipline where throughout the day, I'm pausing to be with God, to take an inventory, to pray, to be centered, to take times of silence. And I need those times to really center myself. So that's where the practice of daily office is kind of like taking mini Sabbaths throughout the day, so that I can commune with God.
That is so good. Drew, man, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hanging out with us a little bit today. I know that there's going to be a lot of discussion that's going to come out of this. And I just want to encourage you, if you're watching this today, if you're on our Facebook Live, share this with somebody. I know that all of us know guys and people, guys and gals that we're doing ministry with that would love to hear this right now. That would be very helpful. Drew, is there any way that you'd like to share that anybody can get a hold of you?
I would definitely say the Emotionally Healthy website.
Okay.
You could also
emotionallyhealthy.org. We'll drop
emotionallyhealthy.org. The church that I'm part of is HopeMidtown.org. I'm not on social media as well. I have social media as well. But yeah, otherwise, be great to hear, and you can contact me through those websites or social.
Thank you, Drew. And I look forward to having more conversations. I mean, I told Scott, we can come back and do this as a series, because there's a lot of stuff that we can talk about when we talk about the emotional health of the pastor. But thank you for what you meant to me, how you've helped me. And I know how beneficial this is going to be to our guys today. So make sure you leave in the chat, folks, that where you're watching from today. And if we can help you in any way, please let us know. So thankful that you are giving to the cooperative program. That's one of the ways we get to do what we do and get to do this and present this stuff to you. So God bless you. As we always say, we're here for you. We want you to be successful and effective as disciple makers. And as we've talked about today, what we really want to say is we want you to finish well. So God bless you. Let us know how we can help you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. We want to continue the conversation from today's broadcast in a learning community near you. These learning communities are designed to celebrate your biggest wins, resource your greatest need, and help you finish well. We also want to give you a free gift, the 5 discipleship shifts most churches need to make to produce world-impacting disciple makers. You can download this resource by going to ministryboom.com. This 5-page PDF is a discipleship alignment checklist. The Georgia Baptist Mission Board is able to provide resources like this because of gifts from Georgia Baptists to the cooperative program. For more information on this broadcast and a customized discipleship plan for your church, visit gabaptist.org/discipleship. Engage with us on your time through Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and all podcast platforms. Lastly, if you've benefited from this conversation today, please share this with a friend as we seek to help churches make world-impacting disciple makers.